They say a photograph never lies, but they never accounted for someone willing to rewrite 30 years of history one pixel at a time. Imagine waking up to find your own face slowly vanishing from your family albums, each missing you a quiet step toward replacing you entirely. This is the story of how a local print shop's backup policy unraveled a plan so cold that a divorce judge called it attempted identity theft in front of a packed courtroom. Meet Thomas Whitfield, a retired history professor who discovered his wife was methodically erasing him from 30 years of family photos. She was building a fake history for a new man, but a local print shop's policy of archiving every job just handed him the evidence to prove it. Thomas Whitfield had spent 40 years teaching students that history is not a fixed record. It is a story told by whoever holds the pen. He just never imagined he would become a chapter someone tried to delete. For 3 decades, Thomas and his wife Barbara lived what looked like a quiet, sturdy life in a colonial house in Asheville, North Carolina. He taught American history at the local university. She ran a small interior design consultancy. They raised 2 children, took summer trips to the Outer Banks, and filled the hallway walls with framed photographs of every milestone. The photos were not just decoration. They were proof of a shared life, a couple growing older together. When Thomas retired at 67, he assumed the next chapter would be gentle. What arrived instead was a slow unspooling that started with a single strange detail he almost overlooked. It was the Thanksgiving photo from 2014. The whole family stood on the front porch, golden leaves behind them. Thomas noticed his own face looked slightly blurred at the edges, as if the camera had misfocused. He asked Barbara about it, and she said the original file was corrupted, so she had the print shop reprint it from a scan. He trusted her. A few weeks later, he spotted another. Their anniversary dinner in Charleston, a photo he had always loved because Barbara was laughing. In the new version, he was gone entirely, not blurred, removed. Barbara claimed she'd ordered a copy for a frame that only she would use, and the shop must have made a terrible mistake. She said it with such calm that Thomas felt foolish for pressing, but the historian in him began to notice more. A photo from their daughter's wedding now just showed Barbara hugging the bride. The space where Thomas had stood was seamlessly filled with background trees. It was expert work, the kind that demands time and money. He started checking the prints more carefully. Every new photo that appeared in a frame around the house had the same subtle quality. He was being erased. Silently, systematically, frame by frame. When he confronted Barbara a second time, her patience cracked. She told him he was being paranoid, that he was a retired man with too much time on his hands, and that the photos were just a project she was working on. Her tone was sharp enough to stop the conversation, but not sharp enough to hide the careful rehearsal behind it. That night, Thomas sat alone in his study and listed every altered image he could recall. The list grew to 27 photographs spanning 15 years. Each one removed him a little more. Each one, he would later understand, was part of a larger reconstruction. He remembered the print shop, the same local place where Barbara had taken the originals for the reprints. It was a small family-run business that had handled their holiday cards and graduation announcements for years. Thomas drove there on a Tuesday morning and asked the owner, a woman named Ellen, if she remembered the orders. Ellen did. She said Barbara had brought in flash drives dozens of times over the past year, each time asking for specific edits. Remove the older man, blend the background, sometimes insert another person into the gap. Ellen had assumed it was a memorial project. But because of the shop's policy, she explained, every single original file was automatically backed up to a secure archive along with the edit request forms, dates, and payment records. Thomas felt his chest tighten. He asked Ellen to pull everything. She hesitated, then printed out the first form and slid it across the counter. The document listed the original image, the edit instructions, and a customer note Barbara had typed. It read, and this is a direct quote, "Please remove Thomas completely and adjust lighting to match surrounding scene. The replacement images of Gary will be provided on the next drive." Gary, Thomas had never heard the name before. He now had proof that Barbara was not merely removing him from family pictures, she was installing a stranger. And the archive Ellen handed him that afternoon contained every single piece of evidence, time-stamped, preserved, and ready to tell a truth that Barbara had spent months trying to bury. What he did not yet know was how far she had already taken the new narrative, or that she planned to use it inside a courtroom. Thomas drove home with the manila envelope on the passenger seat. heavy as a stone. The shop owner, Ellen, had offered to copy everything onto a thumb drive, but Thomas wanted the physical documents, tangible proof that he had existed in his own life. That evening, he locked the door to his study and spread the contents across the desk. Edit request forms, dated across 14 months. Payment receipts. The original photographs, bright and unaltered, next to the versions Barbara had requested. In the new prints, he was gone. In his place stood a man he had never seen before. Broad-shouldered, silver temples, a practiced smile. The removal was surgical. The replacement was deliberate. The forms were specific. Remove Thomas from left side of frame, blend background to match sky from adjacent image. Insert Gary on Barbara's right, adjust lighting to 4 p.m. golden hour. Gary. Barbara had typed that name without sentiment, like it was a furniture specification. Thomas searched his memory. Who was Gary? The answer arrived not from the documents, but from his phone, when he opened a social media app and typed Barbara's name alongside a new contact he had never noticed. There, in a profile picture, was the same man with his arm around Barbara at a beach, a location Thomas immediately recognized. It was the same stretch of the Outer Banks where he and Barbara had vacationed for 20 summers. The photo was dated the previous July, a week when Barbara had told him she was visiting her sister in Raleigh. He confronted her that night in the kitchen, no preamble. He laid the original photograph of that beach trip on the counter, the one where he stood next to Barbara, squinting in the sun. Then he laid the doctored version beside it. Gary, in his place. Barbara's face shifted through 3 expressions in as many seconds. Surprise, calculation, then something colder. You went to the print shop. She said it without guilt, more like an observation. Thomas asked her who Gary was. She poured herself a glass of wine and told him with a terrifying calm that Gary was a retired financial advisor she had met 3 years ago at a design conference, that he was kind, attentive, and present. The word present landed like a blade. She said she had been unhappy for a decade. Thomas had been too absorbed in his books, his lectures, his students. She had started building a real life with someone who showed up. The photos, she said, were just a way to clean up the record. She had already begun telling their children the new story. Thomas was the absent one. Gary was the steady presence they had just never met formally. He asked her if she intended to use the photos in court. She looked him directly in the eye and said, "I filed for divorce this morning. The paperwork will arrive tomorrow." She had been preparing for months. The doctored photographs were not some private fantasy. They were entered as evidence of her domestic arrangement with Gary, submitted alongside her petition for exclusive use of the house, spousal support, and a finding that Thomas had emotionally abandoned the marriage long before the separation. She was constructing a legal narrative in which Thomas had been so absent from family life that his removal from the photographic record was simply documentation of what was already true. Thomas felt the historian's reflex kick in: original sources, corroboration, chain of custody. He had the unaltered files. He had the time-stamped edit requests. He had Ellen ready to testify about Barbara's specific instructions. The archive was airtight, but Barbara didn't know that yet. As she stood there explaining her legal strategy with the rehearsed confidence of someone who thought she controlled the past, Thomas realized that his silence was his greatest asset. If she knew he had the originals, she would attempt to discredit them, claim he had manufactured them, or worse, destroy the only remaining copies. The print shop had the digital backups, but Ellen had already told him that the archive policy only kept files for 18 months. Time was against him. The divorce papers arrived the next morning by courier, a thick packet. Inside, attached to a sworn affidavit from Barbara, were 23 photographs, every single one altered. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, graduations. Gary stood in Thomas's place like an actor seamlessly edited into a classic film. Barbara had written beneath the exhibit list, "The following images reflect the true domestic life of the respondent's spouse and her partner, Gary Abrams, during the period in which the respondent was largely absent from family milestones." The casual cruelty of that phrase, largely absent, while her hired editor had painted over his face with a stranger's jawline, felt like a second erasure. The hearing for temporary orders was set for 3 weeks away. Thomas contacted a forensic divorce attorney who specialized in digital evidence. The attorney reviewed the archive and told Thomas that if Barbara had submitted altered photographs as authentic under oath, she had committed not just perjury, but evidence tampering. In family court, that kind of bad faith could flip the entire case. The judge could strike her petitions, award sanctions, and potentially grant Thomas everything he wanted. But it would hinge on one moment, presenting the truth in open court before Barbara could adapt her story. And between now and that day, no one, not his children, not his neighbors, not Barbara herself, could know what Thomas carried in that manila envelope. The rehooks are built into the escalating revelations, and now the final line leaves the audience tensely waiting as Thomas prepares for a courtroom showdown with his wife's entire constructed reality at stake. The 3 weeks between the filing and the hearing became a test of endurance. Thomas told his children nothing, not because he didn't trust them, but because he knew Barbara had already fed them the story. Any pushback from him would look like a bitter ex-husband trying to rewrite the past. He had taught graduate seminars on historical revisionism. He knew that the most effective lies are the ones that arrive first and come wrapped in love. His daughter, Annie, called him one evening. Her voice was careful. The way you talk to someone you believe is finally being held accountable. Dad, Mom told me about Gary. She said he's been around for a while. She showed me photos from my own college graduation. You weren't in them. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, gripping the phone, and asked Annie which graduation. She described the doctored image of her diploma handoff, Barbara on one side, Gary on the other, Thomas nowhere. He had been there. He had flown with Annie that morning. He had the flight receipt and the original photograph, but he could not say that without revealing the full map of Barbara's deception before the courtroom was ready to receive it. He simply told Annie he loved her and that some things were going to come out she wasn't expecting. She hung up sounding confused and vaguely disappointed. Barbara moved out that second week to stay with Gary in a rented condo. But before she left, she filed an emergency motion alleging Thomas had become emotionally unstable and was stalking her. The motion cited his visit to the print shop as evidence of obsessive behavior. Barbara's attorney argued that Thomas was constructing a paranoid fantasy to avoid the reality of the divorce. For 48 hours, Thomas faced a temporary restraining order that would have removed him from his own home. His lawyer, a woman named Dana Cross, who specialized in high-conflict digital evidence cases, filed a swift opposition. She argued the print shop visit was legitimate discovery, not stalking. The judge denied the emergency motion but scheduled a status conference. Thomas was allowed to stay in the house, but the damage was done. In the court's eyes, he was already the respondent in a contested divorce where the petitioner, Barbara, claimed years of emotional neglect supported by photographic evidence. And then came the moment that made everything worse. Ellen, the print shop owner, called Thomas on a Thursday. She sounded shaken. A woman claiming to be Barbara's sister had come into the shop asking to pick up some old family photo orders. She had a handwritten note with Barbara's signature. Ellen didn't have a sister, and the note was forged. She refused, and the woman left abruptly. Thomas realized Barbara was trying to access the archive to destroy the originals. He immediately drove to the shop, thanked Ellen for her integrity, and together they moved the entire digital backup to a secure cloud server under his attorney's name. The manila envelope now had a digital twin, encrypted and provably unaltered. That night, Thomas sat in his study and examined the edit request forms more carefully. He noticed a detail he had previously missed. On multiple forms, Barbara had checked a box labeled Date Adjustment and written specific instructions. Change timestamp to June 2015, apply to family weekend. She hadn't just erased him, she was manufacturing alibis. Photos of herself and Gary were being backdated to years before they had even met, inserted into family vacations Thomas had actually attended. She was building a parallel timeline in which Gary had been the constant and Thomas the intermittent ghost. For a man who had spent his life studying how tyrants rewrite history, it was almost too on the nose. The evidence weighed on him. Barbara's lies were now embedded in legal filings, social media posts seen by their neighbors, and worst of all, the memories of his children. Annie had stopped returning his calls. His son Marcus, who lived in Portland, texted him a single sentence, "I don't know what to believe anymore." Thomas wanted to call Barbara and scream, but he didn't. He preserved his silence like a weapon. With 2 days left before the hearing, Dana called with an unexpected development. She had run a background check on Gary Abrams. Gary was a retired financial advisor, just as Barbara had said, But what Barbara hadn't told anyone was that Gary had been disciplined twice by the state licensing board for fraudulent client documentation. He had a history of constructing fabricated financial records to cover up poor investments. Thomas felt a cold clarity settle over him. Barbara hadn't found a partner, she had found a collaborator. Their specific skill sets, hers in design and photo manipulation, his in document forgery, were not coincidentally aligned. This was a professional-grade operation run by two people who had been perfecting the art of false reality for years. The discovery shifted the legal strategy. Thomas was no longer just proving Barbara had altered photos. He was now building the case that the entire divorce filing was a fraudulent document, supported by a forged photographic record and backed by a man with a documented history of deception. The judge, Dana predicted, would be more than just skeptical. She would be furious. But the risk remained that Barbara's story, already seeded with the children and the court, might survive even this revelation unless the presentation was undeniable. The night before the hearing, Thomas sat alone in the living room. He opened the manila envelope one more time and laid out the original photographs. Images of birthday parties, fishing trips, quiet Sunday mornings in the garden. He traced his finger across his own face, there, real, present. Barbara's betrayal had not just erased him from paper, it had tried to erase him from the memory of the people he loved most. And that, he understood, was a kind of violence that no court order could undo. But the next morning, he would show the world the difference between a story and a lie. The hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. in a family courtroom that smelled of old paper and floor wax. Thomas arrived early with Dana Cross at his side and the manila envelope under his arm. Barbara was already there, seated beside her attorney in a navy blazer, composed, confident. Gary Abrams was not present. Dana had advised him to stay away, which told Thomas that Barbara's side had already begun to calculate the optics. On the petitioner's table lay a binder of exhibits. Thomas could see the edges of the doctored photographs sticking out from the plastic sleeves. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Kemper, mid-60s, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for zero patience in the face of dishonesty. She opened by acknowledging the temporary motions and then asked Barbara's attorney to present the basis for the divorce filing. Barbara was called to testify first. She spoke clearly, describing a marriage in which Thomas had been absent for years. She referenced the photographs. She held up the doctored Thanksgiving image, the Charleston anniversary photo, the daughter's wedding. She pointed to Gary standing beside her. She said, "This is the man who was actually present." She did not cry. She did not stumble, she was good. Then Dana stood for cross-examination. She approached the witness stand and placed a single original photograph beside the exhibit. The difference was immediate and undeniable. Thomas appeared where Gary now stood. The background details matched exactly. The lighting was identical. Dana asked Barbara who had edited the photos. Barbara hesitated. She said she had requested some touch-ups for personal reasons, but that the changes were cosmetic. Dana then produced the print shop edit request forms, the ones with Barbara's signature and the explicit instructions. Remove Thomas completely. Insert Gary. Adjust date to 2015. The courtroom grew silent. Barbara's composure cracked. She claimed the forms were fabricated. Dana had anticipated this. She called Ellen to testify. Ellen, who had owned that print shop for 18 years, took the stand with her archive logs and the electronic timestamps. She explained the shop's automatic backup policy. She described Barbara's first visit, the thumb drives, the payments made from a credit card in Barbara's name. She produced the email confirmation receipts, every piece of evidence locked into the next like the tumblers of a vault door. The judge leaned forward, and then Dana introduced the final document. It was the background check on Gary Abrams, the license board disciplinary records, the pattern of fraudulent documentation. Dana argued that Barbara had not merely altered family photos for emotional comfort. She had submitted them to the court as sworn evidence, in collaboration with a man who had a documented history of constructing false records to deceive institutions. This was not marital dysfunction. This was a planned, coordinated act of legal fraud. The judge's expression went very still. Barbara's attorney requested a recess. It was denied. Judge Kemper addressed Barbara directly. She asked whether she understood that submitting doctored photographs under oath constituted perjury and evidence tampering. Barbara's answer was barely audible. The judge then struck her petition for exclusive use of the house. denied her request for spousal support and ordered the original, unaltered photographs entered into the permanent record as the authentic family history. She further referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of criminal charges. Barbara Whitfield left the courtroom in tears. Her narrative collapsed entirely. Thomas was awarded the house. More importantly, the legal record now stated explicitly that the original photographs were the true record of the Whitfield family. His children, who had been told the false story for months, were informed through their mother's own discredited testimony. Annie called him that night. She was sobbing, apologizing. She said she had seen the originals. She remembered him being there. She had let the doctored images overwrite her own memory. That admission, more than any legal victory, was what allowed Thomas to finally exhale. The final surprise came a week later when Ellen asked Thomas to stop by the shop one last time. She handed him a small flash drive she had not entered into evidence. On it were the original voice messages Barbara had left when scheduling the edits. Thomas listened to Barbara's voice, cheerful, matter-of-fact, instructing Ellen to remove him from a Christmas morning photo and replace him with a man named Gary. The recording also revealed that Barbara had planned to have all remaining original files destroyed after the divorce was finalized. Ellen had kept them anyway. She told Thomas he deserved to hear the truth in his wife's own voice, so he would never doubt that the betrayal was real and that he had survived it because someone else chose to keep the record intact. Thomas reframed every original photograph and hung them back on the hallway wall, not as decoration, as a declaration. He told me once, months after the hearing, that the hardest part was not the courtroom drama. It was learning that a person you loved could look at a picture of a shared life and decide you never belonged in it. But he also said something that has stayed with me. He said that truth is stubborn. It hides in backup drives and honest shop owners and the memories of children who just needed permission to trust their own eyes. Barbara had the editing software, the forged signatures, the rehearsed story. What she did not have was someone who chose to keep the record. That small decision, a print shop's quiet policy, became the hinge on which an entire life swung back into place. So the next time you scroll past a photo, consider what it's actually holding. Someone's proof, someone's memory, maybe even someone's last standing evidence. If this story meant something to you, please like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And if you have your own story of a truth that refused to be erased, leave it in the comments. We read them, and we never stopped believing that the real record matters.